Good morning. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of Managing Case Files. Today's presenters are Michael Martin and Jennifer O'Neill. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have questions, please type them in the chat feature to the side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn the presentation over to Michael.
Thank you, Rich. As Rich said, my name is Michael Martin, and today Jennifer and I are going to talk to you about managing your case files. And here's the thing, it doesn't really matter if you have student records, police investigative files, patient files, you name it. We're all trying to wrap our arms, right, around this ever-growing volume of records. That is why you're here today, after all, right? So, first things first. What exactly are we going to be talking about today? Today, we're going to be talking about the following. We're going to define what case files are and look at some examples that are found in government, various formats that are used to maintain and preserve them as well. We are going to discuss their creation, what is inside of them, and look at ways to improve their access, including some digital options. We are going to talk about the retention and disposition requirements, including the ever famous LGS-1 retention schedule and the state agency general schedule as well, and the importance of developing policies and procedures to document and maintain a consistent system for managing all of your case files. We have an image here, an example of a person just examining file folders in a row of filing cabinets. To give you an idea, this is what you're going to deal with when you start working with those case files. So, what are the problems that we're going to run into? Okay, we're going to just start out by listing just some of the many common problems with managing case files. There's poor filing cabinets. Here we're talking about cabinets that have no locks, are missing parts, or are just simply difficult to open or close due to rust or age. Unfortunately, we're all kind of familiar with that from time to time. Other problems, no color or color coding system. This is really needed for files with like having top tabs, that sort of thing. Poor or no organization at all for your files. You know, no organization, no idea what you're running into, just boxes of papers. No master list of subject terms for staff creating files to follow. Okay. If there's no master list, then people don't know what to refer to. Or maybe you have active files that are overcrowded with inactive records. You got a mix of the two. Or you don't have any kind of automated retrieval. You can't identify things quickly and pull them. Or perhaps, there are no policies and procedures. And there's always the ever famous, records with mixed retention. Most case files contain records with mixed and event-based retention. So you're going to run into things that have different retention all in the same box from time to time. And on this page, we have an example of someone completely surrounded by their paper records that go all the way to the ceiling. So you can see it can become an overwhelming problem pretty quickly. So the results of poor versus efficient file management of case files, can be pretty obvious, but there are some comparisons we can do. Okay, there's the waste of time, the risk of loss of information, all of that. But the biggest risk may be your time wasted trying to use files that aren't managed, that aren't organized, that aren't in a way that can make them workable for you. Not finding the information you need to do your job or to serve the public. When you cannot find something and you cannot make it available, it makes you look like you cannot do your job. And that is something everybody wants to avoid. Worst of all is losing critical information due to poor or even no filing system at all. Because if you have something filed, but it is not where it's supposed to be, then it's like it's lost or it's never been or it's never existed at all. So again, having the files is great, but being able to manage them and identify them is key. The goal of this whole webinar really is to help you manage your case files efficiently and to reap the benefits of that. So what what are we exactly talking about when we're talking about case files? Case files are, specific. They are information compiled that relates to a specific person, project, or event. They contain different documentation about the person, project, or event. It has the information you need, the specific information. They often are records that come from many different sources that are either created or received by your organization. And those records often have different retention period, which could range from 0 till no longer, till no longer needed to permanent. Many records in the files will have event-based retention. So this means that something has to happen before the record's retention period is applied. Whether it's somebody has to leave your organization or, an appeal has been finally resolved, something to that effect, some major event has to occur. So, person leaves your organization before a 6-year retention period is applied for a personnel file, for example. And here we have an image of some open shelving with folders and case files that are ready to be pulled. So ready to go, first things first. And we have, some more examples of case files. Is anyone managing other case files than those on the slide? You can feel free to, comment in the chat box if you would like. But your most common ones are personnel, social services, student, medical, legal, and so on. And I see court files is one of them as well. Yeah, court files are a little bit different because they don't necessarily follow all the schedules that we have. Board of Education files, I see that's coming up as well. Yeah, those are ones as well. You're going to come across different ones as case files. And we talked about some of those events and projects. Yep, town records, sure. But some of those events and projects are things like capital projects, property, investigative, infrastructure planning, board minutes. Yes, those are records, but not necessarily case files. But we can talk about that. Certain medical, legal, and investigative files, can be destroyed eventually after fulfilling a specific event-based retention period, like 7 years after the patient is treated or 6 years after a case is closed. These are common. They all include, event-based retention, and many include a mix of records, again, with that retention from 0 to permanent. So what are we talking about when we're talking about filing these and managing these? At this point, we're going to talk about specifically filing these case files. Case files are filed together as a record series, like personnel files, property files, and student files. Individual case file in a series is created to support the same activity or function. For example, your personnel administration. It's one we're all very common with. Case files usually contain similar documents or data, which may be organized within the file by the record type or retention. Okay, so filed together as a series, support the same activity, contain similar information, and then those case files are within that larger series, and that identifies the unique individual or the unique file for each person. And then, of course, as with everything, they have that mixed retention. So on this slide, you can see a description of personnel file from the state agency general schedule. Most of the records described have a retention of 6 years after the person leaves the organization. However, there are any disciplinary actions. Sometimes those may be kept separate or separated within the file for early disposal. That's just one example. So at this point, I am going to hand it over to Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Michael. So I am going to talk about some of the, well, all of the case file formats that are currently out there. So first we're going to start with the most common one. I think everyone's familiar and has used paper case files at some point in their life. People are very comfortable using them. Um, they're a very low cost format. You can store records that are in paper for 100 years, given that they're stored in adequate environmental conditions and you don't have to usually worry about it. They can be used throughout their record's life cycle for both active and inactive phases. But there are some drawbacks to using paper case files. For instance, they can be very voluminous. This image on the screen is of the State Record Center where agencies store their inactive records. And I would dare say that most of the records that agencies store with us are case files. So they can be quite big. They also may require special physical security, so you may need to lock them up, for instance, to limit access if you don't want people accessing confidential information or you want to limit access. Also keep in mind that it's very easy if someone pulls a file, they may lose it, it may get misfiled, so essentially that file is lost forever. The next type of case file are digital case files, and by digital case files, I'm talking about paper case files that have been scanned. These are usually managed on a network file drive. So for instance, the image you see on your screen is probably, I think it's a town's local area network, and you can see the various file folders. These could also be integrated into an electronic case management or content management system rather. Case files that are good candidates for scanning would be those that are frequently accessed. They would also allow you, if they're properly set up within your network drive or content management system, they could allow for frequent and rapid retrieval. So for instance, if you wanted to be able to, you've got your case files filed by case number, and you want to be able to look up a particular individual's name. If you had your system set up properly, you would be able to find the name based on the case number. It's also helpful if you require multiple user access. So if you have various people in the office that all need to use these case files at one time, or you have some regional offices that need access to your central files, this would be a good solution. And because they're in digital format, it's easier than paper records to provide access controls. You could do it at the folder level, the file level. The content management system could also allow you to manage access. And it's harder to misfile the information because you can usually run some sort of general search and be able to find the file. But this requires really careful planning and controls in place in order for it to work properly and effectively. You can't just simply start scanning records and call it good. You're going to need to plan for what technology you need based on your needs, your workflow, whatever your process is. You're also going to need to set up a file structure and naming conventions, which we're going to talk about in more depth later on. And you'll need some controls in place to make sure that everyone is consistently following these structures and naming conventions you've set up. I have to really underscore here that for any type of scanning project you're doing, scanning will not solve all of your problems. We're dealing with an agency right now who is going to be moving to a different building, and they have voluminous paper case files. These case files are not well managed. And they want to simply scan all of these case files. We've told them that's not solving any problem. The records are not well managed in their paper format. Scanning them's not going to help it. Also, the records are essentially inactive. They're very infrequently accessed, so it doesn't make sense to scan them. Instead, we've recommended that they simply box them up, send them off to inactive record storage. Next, we're going to look at electronic case files, and these are records that were submitted electronically, usually in some sort of textual information, or you've keyed it in on your end, but it's basically fully electronic process and fully electronic information. There's no imaging involved, so there's no imaging costs. And usually these are integrated, again, like with the digital case files, into an electronic content management system or a case management system. Those systems are usually pretty complicated databases. So for an example of one might be a student information system where you would manage general student data, like information about their grades, the classes they took, their attendance, and special education case files. This is not a solution for every situation. So there are cases where you may need someone to submit a hard copy ink signature as part of the complete your work process. So for instance, if you're a local government and you've been involved in our local government grant program, you have to submit some paper forms with ink signatures as part of that process. The rest of the process is electronic. You're submitting information through our grants database in electronic format. Another type of case files are online hosted web-based case files. And these are usually situations where you need to share data with another level of government. So these are usually hosted by external entities such as a county, state, or federal governments. These are usually very sophisticated online databases that allow both you and other entities to access. And some examples of this, and some were given earlier, court records. real property records, social services, criminal justice, GIS and mapping applications. Another type of case file, and these are less, we're seeing these less frequently, at least being created these days. There's certainly plenty of microfilmed case files that still exist that were microfilmed a number of years ago. But this microfilm is a good format to use for inactive case files. One of the benefits of using microfilm is that it allows you to bring together documents of various sizes within a case file and store them together. So if you had like a building construction project file, you could bring together your plans, your large scale plans, along with standard text documents that you may have as part of that file. It can be challenging to access. So a lot of places no longer have microfilm readers available on site. And also, like if you want to be able to share microfilm case file with someone and the film contains confidential information on it, maybe in one of the case files, it may be difficult for you to provide access to other case files that may not have confidentiality issues. It can also be difficult if you have records that have different retention periods stored within that project file. You're going to have to maintain that microfilm for the duration of the longest retention period. You can improve access by indexing the information on the film. For instance, you can use the blips on the film in order to create indexes. I think the biggest benefit for microfilm is that it's very easy to preserve. Microfilm can last hundreds of years if stored in good conditions, and it serves as an effective backup and preservation copy for your case files. And then the final type of, and it's not really a type of case files, but this is probably used by a lot of governments, is hybrid case files. So you're using a combination of the different formats that we just talked about. Which combination you use is going to vary on your purpose. So for instance, you may have case files in paper format to record the information initially, but then decide to use microfilm for storage or preservation, particularly for your inactive case files. And then you may decide maybe going forward or that you either scan or create an electronic process for your case files. It also helps to have different types of formats to have built-in redundancy. So like I mentioned just a couple minutes ago, microfilm is a great preservation format for especially permanent case files that you might have. Electronic case files are great, but they're a little harder to manage, particularly if you need to keep them for permanently or for a long period of time. So each case file series should be evaluated individually to determine the best management solution for you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, different considerations for case files, creation and content during the life cycle of the record, ways to improve access. And yes, this includes scanning or digitizing the records, confidentiality and security, the physical management. Here we're talking about how to deal with your paper records, obviously, and the retention and disposition, strategies for addressing records with mix and event-based retention. Talked about that a number of times, and now we're going to explain, how we can deal with that. So, the management of case files will change during their life cycle due to mixed and event-based retention, which, not surprisingly, makes them a real bear to manage. Okay, so addressing certain issues early in the life cycle will help improve their overall management. Okay, so for example, when a case file is first opened and active, it is the ideal time to decide a few things: how the files will be set up, what terms will be used to name each file, what records will they contain, and the retention period of those records. Where will those records reside? Will everything be in one file? And if so, what format? Or will there be kind of the hybrid system that Jennifer was talking about? Also, will the records remain at the same storage location, or will they be transferred to another location at some point when they are inactive? Security and access restrictions should be considered at the beginning, not later, and steps for managing the files once they're inactive and their final disposition. Anticipating the records and the retention early on really gives you the ability to separate the records by the retention periods, which can be one way to make records disposition easier once the case files become inactive or are closed. For most case files, all the records they contain are not permanent. Under those circumstances, a good strategy to manage the records in the file is to address records disposition twice. Once by the longest retention period of all the records in the file that is not permanent, and then any remaining permanent records. So we separate the two. So we're anticipating large file formats, like those in building or something like that. We're talking about that. We want to make sure that we're dealing with those as we need to. So our next image, right, is a slide as a business process map from the Digital Topaz kit. Okay, this maps the relationship between units and functions related to building and property regulation. It is intended to plan for an ECM, but it could also be used to identify the map and the flow of records for any single government activity resulting in a case file. The center of the image shows the planning unit's place in the process for approving the building of a subdivision when the related case file is opened, how it's named, key records that it should contain, and the unit responsible. In this case, the records identified will be stored electronically, but here's the key: the same information could be used to establish your paper files as well. And if anybody's eagle-eyed or curious, the SEQR is the State Environmental Quality Review. You're seeing all those acronyms kind of spitting out. That's one of them. Just wanted to note that just in case anybody was interested. All right. So now we're talking about using a database to track case files. It's one way to improve access and retrieval when the records are paper or in a hybrid system. It's a good way to keep track of things. Database could also be either the starting point of an imaging system where search results link to digital images of case file records, or it could be used to populate index fields when implementing a document management software, your content management system. A tracking system can be set up in-house or off the shelf, and it will give you greater control of your files. It'll also enable you to track more information about your files, document and make decisions about the files. For example, designate a file inactive and assign a disposition date for the entire file or specific records within the file itself. It can provide multiple access and retrieval points, and it may allow for automated retrieval. Here we have some example of fields to use for tracking that include the case number, the case title, a person's name, a project title, the number, which is assigned by a central office. And then we have, the dates that are opened and closed. You're using that for tracking age and retention of cases, location with active files. So inactive storage, what's the location? Active files, inactive, microfilm, digital systems, so on. What's the date of the disposition? So the database can give you a list of all the records to dispose of on a certain date. Spit it all out at once. File status, is it open? Is it closed? Active or inactive? The case manager, this is the person or position in charge of maintaining that file. So now we're thinking about files management for access. And this slide really provides an example of filing equipment for active paper files. These examples are designed to reduce the amount of storage space used in an office. Here we have an image of files stored in two-sided shelving units, the mobile shelving units that flip, right? You store the files in a manner that makes them more accessible by making the files more visible. Whole idea is that they're easier to get to, they're quickly visible, people can pull them when needed. Now, this does impose a new organization, you may need some new equipment, but the entire design is to improve access. And you can have end tab folders with color or other coding. This kind of equipment supports the use of a coded filing system that uses the colors, letters, numbers, or any combination of these. Now we're going to talk about imaging for access. Now, one way to manage paper case files is to change the format, the storage and management of the files to a document or content management system. An entire series of paper case files, both active and inactive, can be scanned and managed in the system, or a hybrid system could be set up. For example, maintaining active case files on paper. Then, when the files become inactive and records with events-based retention have met those requirements and are purged, any remaining long-term or permanent records might be scanned and maintained electronically. Digitizing paper case files would require planning and setting up a system for those electronic files and involved a project for any kind of day forward procedures. Okay, so you're going to make sure that you're doing things from this point on. Okay, and you want to do things like inventory, organize, and prepare your paper files. You want to scan and index your records, and then you manage the images and you're indexing them in a content management system, which might enable integrating records from born digital systems as well. You need a system for long-term records. It must have remote backups and a migration plan as well. And when we talk about a migration plan, we're talking about a plan to move those electronic records to a different format over time. Because we know some things are going to last a very long time, like PDF, but nothing lasts forever. And when we're talking about permanent records, we're definitely talking about some kind of migration, some kind of format change. So now we're going to talk about an issue that's near and dear to many people, confidentiality and security of the files themselves. Managing case files requires a knowledge about, or at least an understanding of privacy laws, like things like FERPA or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act for student information. As always, when it comes to privacy, if you're not sure, contact the Committee on Open Government for information on public access to the records. They are the experts after all. Confidentiality and security needs should be addressed and implemented at the creation of the files. So think about it at the beginning. We're talking about many examples where if you're setting up a system, you want to think about these things in the long term. So think about the confidentiality and security of the records during the creation of the files, and that security needs to be maintained whether the files are active or inactive. You want to make sure that you're addressing both. Case files on individuals often contain confidential information, but it may be only portion of the files. Some records or parts of records are public and others are not, for example. So your policies and procedures should ensure private information is not released and include steps for things like redaction or how to release information to the public, like the individual case file that it pertains to in the event of a legal request, but making sure that private information is not released. You want to include levels of authorized access for electronic systems and install physical security for your paper files. That's your locked doors. That's your, making sure you have limited access with keys and everything else. If you convert your paper case files to electronic system, you also have to determine who is authorized for access and use, things like password protection, other access controls, and of course, make sure your cybersecurity is up to date. So here are some recommendations to help improve managing your paper case files. Now, paper files can require a lot of space for storage. We looked at different space-saving filing systems for offices, and for inactive storage, the most cost-effective and efficient storage is open metal shelves in boxes. That may require a change on your part, but it's something that's definitely helpful. That may require a change, but these will enable you to store many more files per square foot than your standard filing cabinets because you can store files twice as high. We never recommend storing filing cabinets one on top of another like that. You can weed files on schedule. You're removing unnecessary records. It'll reduce the overall volume and make it easier for you to find what you need. This can occur at certain points in the life cycle of a record. For example, when a case file is moved to inactive storage, or maybe after an event-based retention period has been met, if part of a case file is permanent. To make this easy, you document what records can be removed in your procedures, and you discard duplicate records. This will prevent confusion about what is the official copy, and it will reduce the overall volume of the records. You probably are going to use a filing system. You may need to set up a new one for boxes of inactive files. The important thing is that you have one, and it's a system that everybody understands. Your filing system should enable access and incorporate retention and disposition. There's an image on the slide of well-organized records in a storage area of boxes with open shelving. It shows color coding on the boxes, in this case for court cases. The color indicates the type of case and file, when the file is closed and when they're filed within the boxes by the case number. You want to retire inactive files on a regular basis so your office filing system isn't overwhelmed by records that are inactive. And of course, you can always reformat those inactive records. So this slide has an example of a tool called a case file retention sheet. And it lists the records to be included in a personnel file, their match and retention schedule item, and their retention. And this is something we recommend, for all your case files, if you can create one. Takes a little bit of time, but it's well worth it because it's a really good cheat sheet. Okay, so now we're going to document, documenting details are going to ensure that the correct records are maintained in the file. You're identifying what records can be disposed of 6 years after a person leaves the organization in case of personnel, whether any records must be kept permanently. These notes can be expanded to include information on whether the file requires extra security or authorized access and exists in any formats. With personnel and similar files, as mentioned, one way to make their management easier is to group records by the two longest retention periods and dispose of records twice. So that longest one, and then you talk about permanent. So in this case, we're talking about 6 years after an individual leaves the organization, most of the records are purged, but permanent are retained forever. A case file retention sheet can also help plan a filing system. For example, you might separate those permanent from non-permanent records at creation, or file everything together and purge at specific times. You could retain non-permanent records on paper and scan all the permanent ones or convert the born digital files. So now we're talking about police investigation files. So this example above includes an excerpt from the LGS-1 indicating the retention periods for investigation files. These are based on the type of case. So, for example, we're talking about things like homicide, suicide, missing persons, the really important cases, those retentions are permanent. There's other felonies that have a retention period of 25 years, while misdemeanors are only 5. And there's different consideration for managing these files. It could include you want to separate the records by offense at creation, you want to digitize or scan at creation, and when the long-term case files or permanent case files are closed, identifying them then. You need to think about investigation files. If they're maintained on paper, once closed, they could be filed in color-coded files in boxes like the court cases to help track retention and disposition. And at this point, I am going to hand it over to Jennifer.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to talk about next as an example, some patient case files. And these are specific to the state Office of Mental Health and the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. But you may, if you have patient case files, you may have something kind of similar in place. So they have a pretty complicated retention schedule. And you can see that there are certain elements of the case file that are permanent. And you can see that some case files have been microfilmed and some are in paper. When someone dies or is discharged, that kicks in a retention schedule of 7 to 10 years for routine administrative and fiscal records. And then core records can be destroyed 80 to 110 years after date of birth. So we strongly recommend that these patient files be separated by disposition at creation. I know some regional offices, they have color-coded sheets of paper for different types of documents, and that allows people, even people who aren't familiar with case files, to very easily dispose of records at the appropriate retention period. Then when the person is discharged or death occurs, that would be another opportunity to separate out records that can be destroyed. We recommend that disposition be carried out regularly for routine records, and that the facility send the inactive records to their centralized record storage area at the appropriate time, might be after death or discharge. The agencies also want facilities to digitize files anytime that they're not in their electronic health record case management system. So they also have in many cases for recent records, an electronic copy. Next, we'll look at litigation, legal litigation files. Litigation files at both the local government and state agency level usually are split into two different retention categories. You've got permanent files, those are your landmark policy setting, or maybe they received extensive news coverage or are important to your community. And then most litigation files will be destroyed after 6 or 10 years, depending on what your retention schedule says, after the case is closed, or if there are minors involved, records need to be kept until the minor attains age 21. So we really strongly encourage governments to separate cases into permanent and non-permanent before moving them to the inactive storage area. Keep in mind that the people who may be in place at the time that the records come up for disposition may not be you or the person who was involved in the case. So they aren't going to have the knowledge of the people involved in the case who originally transferred the records to inactive storage about what the contents of the case are and whether they need to be preserved permanently or can be destroyed. So please make sure that you make that decision before they go off to storage. Case files, these types of case files tend to have a lot of duplication in them, so make sure you purge those out. A lot of court copies of court cases in there. We recommend that you create an index so that you can efficiently retrieve these records. Often they are sent to us at the Record Center with case numbers. That's not helpful to us if the agency wants to pull a case based on an individual's name, because we don't have that information in our database, so it's important to have it in yours. If you can, they do have legal case management software products available, and that can help you to file these records and be able to retrieve them efficiently. So, as I think both Michael and I have alluded to, it's really important to have your policies and procedures for case files written down. Oftentimes people do that in the form of a file manual, and that's basically an instruction manual for staff on your files management practices. This will help to ensure that there's consistency across staff and how they create files, what they're putting in those files, and what the retention and disposition of those files are. Well-filed and managed files are easier to retrieve and track. By having a good files management practice in place, you should be able to reduce missed files and duplicates. And having this manual is a good training tool for new staff, and also a good reference for staff to refer back to make sure that they're consistently applying the practices. And if you're ever called to court to testify, to prove the procedures and policies you had in place, the manual's a great tool to be able to point to. In the manual, we've seen entities use or include things like responsibilities, so making it clear who's responsible for doing what. It outlines the file structure and organization of your records and includes steps on establishing a new file, setting up a new file folder. It also outlines what documents should be included within the case file. And make sure that you're updating procedures as needed. The policy will also include information, as Michael mentioned, about access, who should have access to the file, and confidentiality, what information within the files needs to be protected. And it should include information about transfer, like to inactive records or for historic agency records transfer to the state archives, and information about retention and disposition, including weeding of records. So for those of you who registered for this workshop, you were sent a PDF handout. And in the handout, you'll see some sample case file manuals. There's one that was nicely donated to us by the Clarkstown Central School District covering their student files. We also have one for project files that's loosely based on the dormitory authority. Also, you'll find a document that is a file survey for paper records, and that will help you to collect information when you are examining your case files, and you might be just trying to get a sense of maybe making improvements to their organization, or maybe you're looking to purchase um, a some sort of case management system or content management system. That document will be helpful for you. There's also a master list of filing terms with various subject topics. We have a lot of indexing resources available on our website, and there's a URL there to that indexing information. There's also a link to the LGS1 for local governments and the state general schedule for state agencies in terms of retention schedules. And then finally, Michael alluded to and showed you an example of a file structure from the Digital Towpath Cooperative's Electronic Records Management System Toolkit, and there's a URL available for accessing that tool. So with that, we've got a few minutes left, so I will open it up to questions. Rich, I think I've seen some questions come into the general chat, but you may have also received some questions.
Yes, no, we got some questions here. Definitely. We have a question from Sarah. What are good programs for organizing and storing records or records inventories? Currently, we use FileMaker Pro and save documents to the computer and USB drives as backups.
Yeah, so we can't recommend any specific product, but I think more importantly is you have to identify what your needs are and examine your records to understand what requirements you would have for a system, and then do some research and figure out, what systems meet your needs. You may want to also talk with other governments that have similar functions as to you And I see that some people have mentioned in the chat some of the systems that they're using. So they may be some people you may want to reach out to.
Okay, had a couple of questions here from Andrea. Is there a standard of how long we should keep personnel files after an employee has retired and passed away?
So for personnel records, it's 6 years after separation from service, so their service with your government. It's irrespective of death. So even if you hear that they've died in office or they've died, before the 6 years is up after they've retired, you still need to keep it 6 years after separation of service. And death could be considered a separation of service if they're still in office. Hopefully that addresses your question.
And Andrea also commented, had a question about when the master summary came up. Would a master summary with the information included in that standard satisfy that requirement?
So not all, so I assume you're from a local government, and not all local governments might have master summary records for their personnel records. If you do have a master summary record, it would need to be kept permanently. But that doesn't, there are still records that need to be maintained for that 6 years after separation from service. So, check out the LGS 1 to see, we do list specific types of documents that need to be maintained within the personnel file and for how long.
And also, Samantha made a comment. She said we use DocuWare as well at Orange Ulster BOCES and are very happy with it. If you are a school in the Hudson Valley area, you could potentially work with us with permission from your local BOCES. And she also remarked that a portion of all files is permanent, citing number 636. I imagine that would be in the retention schedule. Okay, let's see. I have a couple more comments that just popped in. Oh, just Andrea just said, yes, thank you. So would a master summary with the information included in that standard satisfy? Oh, no, I'm sorry. We just said addressed that. So Carolyn here asks a question. Do personnel files pertaining to volunteer members of a fire department, would that pertain to them as well?
So I can actually answer that one, Jennifer. If a person is considered part of your staff, then yes, they would have a personnel file.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. We still have just a few minutes. And of course, if anybody has any questions after this period of time, again, this session is being recorded and will be available, but you can certainly email us. We can still, you can email us at the email shown. Okay, well, this doesn't make we have any more questions. Michael and Jennifer, any final words before we before we say goodbye?
Thank you everyone for coming today. And we hope that it has been helpful. And please let us know if you have any questions as a follow-up.
Yes, I'll echo what Michael said. Thank you so much for everyone attending and having some great questions for us.
And again, folks, yes, this will be available in the form of a recording, and we'll get an email out to everyone through our constant contact mail list, or you can go to our website and find that as well. All right, thanks very much, everybody.